The address was not delivered in person, nor was it broadcast with the usual pomp of a leader appearing before a nation. Instead, it came as a written statement read by a state television presenter against a backdrop of the Iranian flag, a format that spoke volumes about the chaos engulfing the leadership in Tehran. For 14 days, Mojtaba Khamenei, the newly appointed supreme leader, had remained invisible, wounded in the same American strike that had killed his father and thrown the Islamic Republic into its deepest crisis since the 1979 revolution. When his words finally reached the Iranian people, they carried the weight of a regime fighting for its very survival, a message of unyielding defiance delivered from the shadows. The new leader's rhetoric was calibrated for maximum impact, a direct challenge to Washington and Tel Aviv that left no room for diplomatic ambiguity. He vowed that Iran would extract reparations from the enemy, warning that if the United States and Israel refused to compensate Tehran for the destruction wrought by Operation Epic Fury, his forces would seize from their assets to the extent we deem appropriate or, failing that, destroy an equivalent amount of their assets. It was a declaration of economic warfare, a promise that the cost of the campaign against Iran would be counted not just in missiles, but in dollars and cents, extracted by force if necessary. The strategic centerpiece of his message was a threat that sent shivers through global energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a fifth of the world's oil passes, would remain closed. The lever of closing the Strait of Hormuz must certainly continue to be used, Khamenei declared, framing the waterway not as a transit route but as a weapon. This was not an empty threat. Iranian forces had already demonstrated their capability, effectively halting shipping through the strait and sending oil prices soaring above $100 per barrel. For the global economy already fragile, this was the equivalent of a blockade imposed on its circulatory system. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must rewind to February 28, 2026, the day the old rules of engagement were incinerated. In a coordinated operation, the United States and Israel launched a massive aerial campaign across multiple Iranian cities, targeting military command centers, air defense systems, missile sites, and the very heart of the regime's nuclear infrastructure. But the strike achieved something far more profound than the destruction of hardware. It killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had led Iran for decades, along with 4 senior military and security officials. The shadow war had finally become a direct state-on-state confrontation with the highest possible stakes. The immediate aftermath was a frenzy of retaliatory violence. Iran responded with ballistic missiles and drones launched not just at Israel, but at American assets and allies across the Gulf, including bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan. The conflict, which had simmered for years through proxies and covert operations, exploded into a multi-front regional war. Hezbollah reactivated in Lebanon, Kataib Hezbollah struck American personnel in Iraq, and the Houthis resumed their long-range attacks from Yemen, all coordinated under the banner of Iran's Axis of Resistance. The succession crisis was resolved with unseemly haste. On March 8th, the Assembly of Experts, itself decimated by an Israeli strike days earlier, elevated Mojtaba Khamenei to the position of supreme leader. The son of the slain Ayatollah and a product of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, he represented a hardline continuity that signaled Tehran's intent to fight rather than negotiate. Unlike his father, who had occasionally balanced the IRGC's militarism with diplomatic outreach, Mojtaba was expected to pursue an unrelenting course of confrontation. He entered office marking the occasion with a missile barrage against Israel and Gulf states. The Israeli response to his ascension was as swift as it was chilling. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, addressing reporters in Jerusalem, issued what was widely interpreted as a veiled threat against the new Iranian leader. When asked whether Israel planned to target Mojtaba Khamenei, Netanyahu replied, "I do not intend to provide precise reports here on our plans or what we will do," even as air raid sirens sounded in Israel signaling incoming Iranian missiles. He acknowledged that the Iranian government might not collapse under the weight of American and Israeli operations, but promised to create optimal conditions to destabilize it from within. In Washington, President Trump took to social media with characteristic bombast, claiming that the United States was engaged in efforts to completely destroy the Iranian regime. "We have unparalleled military power, limitless ammunition, and ample time," he wrote, underscoring the scale of American commitment to the conflict. But behind the bravado, strategic confusion reigned. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, when asked how he saw the war ending, offered a chillingly honest answer: I don't know. The administration's stated objectives had shifted repeatedly, from nuclear disarmament to regime change to unconditional surrender, leaving allies and adversaries alike uncertain of America's ultimate intentions. The military campaign, dubbed Operation Epic Fury, had achieved significant tactical successes. American and Israeli forces had destroyed much of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, degraded its navy, and struck missile production facilities. Over 5,000 targets had been hit, including 60 Iranian vessels, but the strategic picture was far murkier. 7 American service members were dead, approximately 140 more wounded, and the United States found itself fighting alone, with no allied nation joining the coalition. Spain, Chile, Russia, China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Egypt had all voiced concern or condemnation, isolating Washington diplomatically at the very moment it needed partners most. The Mojtaba tragedy crystallized the moral and strategic quagmire into which the conflict had descended. A United States Tomahawk cruise missile, operating on decade-old targeting data, struck what was believed to be an IRGC base. Instead, it hit a girls' school, killing more than 170 children in the deadliest civilian casualty event for the American military in recent decades. The Pentagon, having cut by 90% the office responsible for civilian harm prevention, was left to defend the indefensible. Images of pink flowers placed on a school wall, of mass graves being dug for children, circled the globe, doing more damage to American credibility than any military setback could achieve. Iranian Foreign Minister Sayed Abbas Araghchi seized on the Mojtaba massacre in his diplomatic engagements, describing to his Indian counterpart the crimes committed by the United States and Israel, including missile attacks on civilian targets. In a phone conversation with India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, Araghchi held Washington responsible for the disruptions in global energy shipping, arguing that the international community should hold the United States accountable for the instability affecting maritime routes. It was a masterful piece of information warfare, reframing America's military campaign as a violation of international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. The economic consequences of the conflict rippled far beyond the Middle East. Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Thailand announced remote working policies and promoted public transport usage as fuel-saving measures. Oil-importing countries across Asia raised pump prices, while freight costs soared and the aviation industry imposed fuel surcharges. The disruption to global supply chains, already fragile after the pandemic and the tariff wars, threatened to plunge the world economy into recession. For every leader in Europe and Asia, the immediate concern shifted from geopolitical solidarity to the stark reality of inflation, social unrest, and the rising cost of living. In Tehran, the new supreme leader's message was carefully parsed by analysts searching for signs of weakness or flexibility. Seema Shine, a former Mossad analyst now at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, noted that Khamenei's speech represented a message of continuity with the axis of resistance strategy. He had specifically thanked the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iraqi Shiite armed groups for their support, signaling that Iran would continue to fight through its proxies even as its conventional forces took punishment. But Shine also detected a possible opening. With their capabilities progressively weakened and faced with what will continue to happen, it's possible they will reconsider their position. The question of Khamenei's health and whereabouts added an element of uncertainty to an already volatile situation. Unconfirmed reports suggested he had suffered facial injuries in the strike that killed his father, injuries serious enough to prevent him from appearing in public or recording a video address. His written statement, read by a journalist, was the only evidence that he remained in control. The IRGC, which had backed his ascension, was now the de facto power in Tehran, its commanders making life and death decisions while the new leader recuperated in an undisclosed location. The Arab capitals of the Gulf watched these developments with a mixture of terror and calculation. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which had spent years building strategic partnerships with Israel to counter Iran, now found themselves caught in the crossfire. Iranian missiles had struck their territory, yet they dared not openly side with the American-Israeli coalition for fear of inflaming their own populations and inviting further retaliation. The Washington Institute captured the central paradox of their position. While the United States and Israel were clearly winning the war in military terms, if they stopped fighting today, they would be judged to have lost. The Russian and Chinese calculus added another layer of complexity to the crisis. Beijing, seizing the moment of American distraction, quietly announced zero tariffs on goods from 53 African countries, a geopolitical statement as significant as any military maneuver. Moscow used its veto power in the United Nations Security Council to block any resolution condemning Iran, framing the conflict as a consequence of American adventurism. The global South, long subordinate to Northern power structures, sensed an opportunity to reshape the rules of international trade and diplomacy in its favor. Within Iran, the regime faced a restive population weary of war, sanctions, and sacrifice. The protests that had periodically rocked the country in recent years, sparked by economic hardship and political repression, remained a latent threat to the regime's stability. Khamenei's address sought to address this vulnerability, calling for national unity and praising the people's volunteer relief structures. But the internet blackout imposed by the authorities, which had dropped connectivity to 4% of normal levels, suggested a regime deeply afraid of its own citizens. The IRGC was distributing white SIM cards to regime supporters, preparing for the possibility that the war might trigger an internal uprising. The nuclear clock, always the most urgent timer in this conflict, continued to tick toward midnight. With Iran's nuclear infrastructure degraded but not destroyed, and with international inspectors effectively absent, Tehran raced to reconstitute its program. The consensus among Western intelligence agencies was that Iran now possessed enough enriched uranium for several weapons and was closer than ever to assembling a deliverable warhead. For Israel, a nuclear-armed Iran remained the ultimate red line, the one threat that could trigger the use of its own undeclared nuclear arsenal in a desperate Samson option. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the region received far less attention than the military maneuvers, but its scale was no less devastating. Civilians in Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen bore the brunt of a conflict they did not choose. Families huddled in shelters, schools emptied, hospitals overflowed with wounded. The United Nations, paralyzed by great power rivalries, could only issue increasingly desperate calls for restraint, calls that were politely received and immediately ignored. For the ordinary people of the Middle East, the war was not a geopolitical abstraction, but a daily reality of fear, loss, and uncertainty. As the conflict entered its third week, the strategic options available to both sides narrowed dramatically. Military analysts at the Small Wars Journal argued that the United States was prosecuting the war with only one instrument of national power, military force, while Iran fought across all five: diplomatic, informational, military, economic, and legal. This asymmetry, unless corrected, threatened to transform American military successes into strategic failure. The authors urged the administration to open back-channel communications with Tehran through Omani mediation, to engage the new supreme leader's inner circle indirectly, and to acknowledge the Manab tragedy transparently to regain the moral high ground. The Israeli perspective, articulated by Netanyahu, remained focused on the immediate military threat. Speaking at a press briefing, the prime minister asserted that Iran is no longer the same following the attacks on the IRGC and Basij forces. He pledged continued action against Hezbollah in Lebanon, describing their retaliatory strikes as unacceptable. But even he acknowledged the limits of military power, admitting that regimes are overthrown from within, not from without. "We can certainly assist," he said, "and we are doing so." It was a tacit admission that the war's outcome would ultimately be decided in Tehran, not Jerusalem or Washington. The new supreme leader's warning to neighboring countries was equally stark. He urged them to close American military bases on their territory as soon as possible, while insisting that Iran sought constructive relations with its neighbors. "We warned in advance, even before the attacks began, that we would strike the bases," he said, "and now we are forced to continue doing so." This was both a threat and an offer. Cease hosting American forces and the attacks will stop. For countries like Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, hosting thousands of American troops, the message presented an impossible choice between their security guarantor and their dangerous neighbor. As dusk settled over the Persian Gulf, the region held its collective breath. The missiles and drones continued to fly, the diplomatic channels remained clogged, and the casualty counts continued to mount. Mojtaba Khamenei, wherever he was recovering from his wounds, had delivered the message his father's regime required: defiance, continuity, and an unwavering commitment to the path of resistance. Whether that message would unite his fractured nation or hasten its unraveling remained the great unanswered question of a war that had already rewritten the rules of the Middle East.